There's a lot of overlap between North and South, same time period, but there's one thing that is radically different between the Northern Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the Italian Renaissance. In the first section of the class, when we were talking about the Italian Renaissance, there are so many beautiful artworks, and many of them, most of them actually, are created specifically to go in churches, to have religious themes, to be placed in things like St. Peter's Basilica. As the protesters act out against the Catholic Church, now capital C Catholic, because we have different denominations, different churches worshiping God through Christianity differently based on different interpretations of the Bible. These protesters, these Protestants, actually push back against having artwork in their churches. They go back to the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament of the Bible and the commandment of thou shalt make no graven images. They view all those artwork inside Catholic churches as idolatry, as taking away from the worship of God. Many of these protesters, these Protestant denominations, are actually what we call iconoclasts. Now, iconoclast, the word icon, I-C-O-N, icon means a religious image or picture. So like a picture of Mary or a saint is an icon. In our modern day, you could argue that pictures of celebrities are icons. They're a worshipful religious image of something. Classed, the second half of this word, a clast is a hater or destroyer. So an iconoclast is a hater or smasher, a destroyer of religious imagery. Now, many of these Protestant denominations, many of these groups of reformers are iconoclasts. They believe that religious images do not belong in churches because they distract from the worship of God. By the way, Luther does not agree with them. Luther thinks they're monkeys. These early protesters, these early Protestants, ban religious imagery from their own churches. A religious location, a church, a Protestant church at this point in history is usually going to be a simple white box. They do not want pictures in their church. They want the focus to be on the written word of God. They want the focus to be on reading the Bible. They don't want people to be distracted by these images. Many of these Protestant denominations actually, as church activities, go to Catholic churches and cathedrals and actively destroy the artwork in the churches. The picture on the screen is the result of one of these church outings. You can see the heads of the statues on the outside of the church have been methodically smashed off and destroyed. This is the work of iconoclasts who believe that these artworks are idols taking away from the worship of God. Now, of course, as a humanities teacher, this makes me twitch and want to smack people. How dare you? But I can play devil's advocate. I can understand where these Protestants are coming from. Basically, for these protesters, for these Protestants, all these religious pictures, these religious images, create a concept in people's heads, and then people can't get past what they've seen. They can't get to what the Bible actually says. I mean, it's silly, but use the analogy. Think of it this way. If you read a book and then they make a movie of the book, when you see the trailer for the movie, when you see the movie, you're like, well, that character doesn't look like that. What the heck? This isn't the way it worked in the book. You have a concept in your head from the book. On the other hand, if you see a movie or a TV show and then you like it and you're like, oh, I want to read the book this is based on. When you read the book, you already have the casting from the TV show or the movie in your head. And when you read the book, you see the actors as the characters. The picture is already stuck in your mind. Basically, that's what the Protestants are saying. They're saying you shouldn't have this artwork because people will get stuck on the pictures. This is like a little kid telling you, oh, God's an old man with a beard. How do you know? I saw it in a picture. It's basically the Protestants want people to focus on the words, on the Bible, on seeking answers for themselves instead of relying on pre-created pictures. Many of them are iconoclasts. Now, again, not all of them. That's not everybody. Luther doesn't agree with this. Many of them are. So, okay, Protestants hate artwork. No, they don't. It's not what I said, guys. Protestants love artwork. They think artwork is beautiful. In fact, many of these protesters, these Protestants who are literate, who can read and write, many of whom are businessmen, they are very passionate about artwork. They want artwork in their homes. They love this beautiful stuff. Wait a minute, that's not what you... Yes, it is. Wait a minute, listen. Protestants do not believe that religious artwork belongs in the church. They do not want religious artwork in their place of worship. When they get together to honor their religious beliefs, they want a place that is simple, undecorated, and focused on the Bible, on reading and discussing the Word of God. That doesn't mean they don't love art. Protestants love artwork. They just do not want it in their church. Protestants want artwork where they can look at it personally, where they can have it in their home. Protestants are passionate about artwork just in private locations rather than public locations. This means that artwork itself is going to change because of supply and demand. Who is wanting to buy artwork? Well, wealthy merchants and business people. Okay. Where are they wanting to buy artwork for? Well, their homes, their private gathering places. That means that spending millions of dollars on a one-of-a-kind fresco is no longer going to be as practical, as likely. Protestants, if you remember in the last lecture at the very end, I talked about the Protestant ideas being more private, more personal. That idea that the Catholic translation of the Bible uses the word charity, public. The Protestant translation of the Bible uses the word love, feelings, personal. Artwork is also going to tend toward the private and personal, which means that instead of one-of-a-kind original paintings and sculptures, Protestants are going to be more interested in something reproducible, something more affordable. Instead of a one-of-a-kind $5 million original, Protestants are going to want a $500 limited edition print. Is that even possible at this point? Yes, you can have a print because we have, guess what? Printing presses. A new type of artwork called reproducible artwork is going to become really popular. Now, it's not a brand newly discovered. This kind of artwork has been around for hundreds of years. It's not something that is invented. It's something that becomes more profitable. More people want to buy it, and since more people want to buy it, more people are going to make it. There are three main types of artwork that are reproducible, made on a printing press in larger quantities. The first of those three kinds of artwork is something called a woodcut. A woodcut is reproducible artwork printed on a printing press. When you make a woodcut, you don't just make one. There are hundreds of copies of this. Again, think of it as a limited edition. Because there are hundreds of copies of a woodcut, each one is less expensive to purchase. So this is the difference between a one-of-a-kind original and a limited edition. This is like a limited edition. It's still expensive, it is still considered artwork, but there are more copies. It's not one and only. A woodcut is made by creating a stamp, essentially, out of a block. You ready? Shock. A block of wood. A woodcut is made out of a chunk of wood. That's why it's called a woodcut. The image is cut into the surface of the block of wood, essentially creating a wooden stamp. You can see in the picture on the screen, once you create the stamp, you roll it with ink. Everything that is raised, everything that is elevated on the block of wood picks up the ink. You put a piece of paper on it, you put it into a printing press, and you press the stamp, the woodcut, against the paper. The resulting picture, the stamp image, is called a woodcut. Now, woodcuts can be extremely elaborate. What you're seeing here is actually an image of a wooden block used to produce a woodcut. The image is carved into the surface of the block of wood with really tiny tools. In the picture on your right, notice the size of the person's fingers compared to the size of the carving tool that they're holding. These are incredibly fine, delicate tools. They carve away anything they do not want to show up on the actual artwork. So anything that is negative, anything that is white space, is going to be carved into the block of wood. The part that is raised up is going to be what creates your picture. That's your positive image. So they carve away the white space. They leave the part that's going to be the picture raised on the block of wood. They then roll ink over the raised wooden stamp, put a piece of paper on it, and print it in a printing press. Woodcuts can be used to create incredibly elaborate, beautiful images, but woodcuts do have limitations. Because you are carving this very delicate image into the surface of a block of wood and then pressing it in a machine that uses 200 to 500 pounds of pressure for each created image, those delicate carved lines on a woodcut are going to wear down over the course of pressing. So if you're going to make 500 copies, by the time you get to the 500th copy, you're going to start losing detail. The wood is going to start to splinter. It's going to start to wide and flatten out. Woodcuts are actually the reason that today we have this weird obsession with having a lower number in a limited edition. With modern technology, out of a limited edition of 500, number 495 looks almost identical to number 1. We're still obsessed with having number 1. That actually comes from the process of woodcuts, because when you're making a woodcut, print number 1 looks clean and precise. All of the lines on the stamp are perfect and nice and sharp. Impression number 495 on a run of woodcut is going to be a little bit blurry and the edges are kind of be mushy. You're going to get a lot of ink splatter because over the course of 500 presses, the wood is going to become splintered and flattened, and the quality of the later presses of a woodcut are not going to be as good as a higher, an earlier number in the limited edition woodcut. One of the ways to avoid that loss of quality and detail is to use a different material for the base of your press, for the stamp, essentially. The other two types of reproducible artwork common at this point use metal instead of wood. So a woodcut uses wood, it's in the name. That is not the case for an etching. An etching is also a form of reproducible artwork created by using a printing press. However, an etching uses a piece of metal. That piece of metal is usually referred to as a metal plate, but in your head, do not picture like a metal dinner plate. Usually this is a big, smooth piece of metal. Most often it is copper that is used for etchings. Now, the way that an etching is made is that the artist will take a piece of copper and they will coat that copper with a wax. The wax is usually greenish black color, and that wax is called a ground. So you have bright shiny copper, think nice shiny penny, covered in this ground, which is a layer of wax. The artist then takes a sharp tool and draws the image that they want to create. They actually sketch out the image in the wax. Now, when they scrape away the wax, you're exposing that bright shiny copper. Let me show you what this actually looks like. In the picture on the screen, you can see the reddish part, that's your copper plate, all right? The black stuff that you're seeing, this stuff over here, is the ground. That is the wax. That wax is actually chemically base, all right? Then the artist takes their engraving or their etching tool, I should say, which is this metal stick right here you can see in the artist's hand. And what they're doing is they're drawing their image through the ground. So what you're seeing in the picture, all of these lines here, these lines are actually what's going to be the picture. Those lines have been incised through the wax. You're seeing the reddish metal of the copper as the wax has been scraped away. Once the artist is done drawing his picture into the ground, then you actually take the metal plate with the wax on it and soak it in acid. What happens at this point when you soak the actual copper plate with the ground, the wax on it, in acid? Because the ground is base, that acid is repelled by the wax. So everywhere there is wax, nothing happens. Everywhere the artist has drawn, everywhere that they've incised, everywhere they've scraped away the wax, the acid actually etches the surface. So the acid actually eats into the surface of the copper. It etches those lines into the plate. Once you take the plate out of the acid and wash it off, you then remove the ground. You scrape away the wax. Everywhere that you had already drawn the picture, there are lines etched. There are lines actually eaten away into the surface of the copper plate. The ink actually gathers in those grooves in the copper plate. So everywhere you've drawn, everywhere you've etched, the ink will pool in those locations, creating lines. You put a piece of paper on it and print it in a printing press, and as you push down, the ink in the etched lines results in a picture. Now, there's good and bad with an etching. The good part is that you can make changes to the etching, you can make corrections because you're just drawing in wax. If you make a mistake, you can just add wax back where you accidentally scraped it away. The bad part of an etching is that an etching creates very precise lines. I always think of it like a pen and ink drawing. Each line is very precise because it is actually etched into the surface very specifically. You can't really get light and shadow. You can't really get good gray tones in an etching. In order to do that, you have to use the third kind of reproducible artwork, which is called engraving. Now, like etching, engraving is going to use a copper plate as its base, a big, smooth piece of copper. However, an engraving does not use wax and acid. Instead, an engraving simply has the artist use a sharp pointed tool, like the one in the picture, and scrape lines directly into the surface of the copper. Now, the advantage to an engraving is that the rougher you make the surface of this copper, if you scrape it up, if you make it really a rough surface, lots of scratches, more ink will be caught in those scratches. More ink will gather in one location. That means that the smoother the copper is, the fewer scratches you place, the less ink will stick there, the smoother the surface will be, and the lighter color will be produced when you press it in a printing press. Engraving, because you can control the scratch marks, allows you to do more gradients. It's not just black and white. It lets you do shading, different colors, different depths of gray tone. An engraving allows you to incise lines directly onto a copper plate. You just scrape the lines right on. Then you put ink on it. More ink will gather in rougher spots, less ink will gather in smoother spots. You wipe off any excess ink, put a piece of paper on it, and print it. The good part is that it allows you to get light and shadow. It allows you to get gray tones. The bad part is there's no takebacks. I mean, if you sneeze in the middle of this, if your cat jumps on your arm, you are going to have a line there. You better make it look like you meant to put that line on the engraving because it's there now. There's no takebacks. It's not like an etching where you're using wax and you can fix if you make a mistake. Engraving, once you scrape it, that's it. It's there. Boom. Now, in the picture, you can see over here, this picture is actually created by an expert in engraving that I'm going to talk about just a lot in just a minute. His name is Albrecht Dürer. You can see he always signs his woodcuts, etchings, and engravings with his AD insignia, that is his signature, his name. This is actually a portrait of a burgher, a wealthy big businessman, not like a hamburger, a wealthy businessman. And you can see how using the engraving method, Dürer is able to create gray and not just black, white, scribbly lines. You can see it in the cap on his head, where you've got this gray tone in the angle of the cap. You can even see it in these, he's got these epic bags under his eyes. You can see it in the lines that he creates on the face. Now, the really cool part about this with an engraving is how he creates that. You can see this if you get like really up close. You can see how engraving creates those shadows by scratching up the surface. And this is wild and crazy to me because of the precision required. In the up-close version of this picture, you can see how Dürer is creating this gray by using cross-hatching. Basically, what he's doing with his engraving tool, with his scratching tool on the actual copper, he's creating a series of perfect lines that are crossed over one another so that the ink that he's going to spread will gather into that area. It will actually gather on the surface where he's created these cross-hatched lines, these interlaced scratches on the surface of the copper plate. As someone who is neither patient nor good with artwork, this is mind-boggling to me, the precision and detail required to do this. The thing is, because it is reproducible artwork, he can do this one time on this copper plate and then create 1,500 copies, which he can sell for a lower fee to people who want to have them in their homes. These are being sold to people who like the ideas of the protesters, to these Protestants. If not formally Protestants, because Dürer works before and after the actual 95 Thesis, the Protestant Reformation's formal beginning. Dürer is selling this to people who are literate, people who are wanting reform in the church, people who agree with Martin Luther's ideas even before the reform actually starts with the 95 Thesis. These images, reproducible artworks, are targeted at private collectors to be displayed in the privacy of someone's personal home. That is actually the business of Albrecht Dürer, the artist who created that engraving that I just showed you. This is actually Albrecht Dürer, a self-portrait that he does of himself at the age of 28. You can always recognize Dürer's artwork and the artwork that comes from his workshop. He doesn't work alone. He has assistants, other people he's teaching. You can always recognize it because it is signed with this AD symbol that marks it as an Albrecht Dürer original. Dürer is a brilliant artist. He actually grows up in a family where his father is a metal worker. He creates things out of various metals, which really is good for Dürer's training in etchings and engravings, both of which start with a copper plate, a piece of metal. Dürer studies art. In fact, he actually travels to Italy. He himself is from the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire, but he travels south to Italy. He studies the work of the Renaissance artists like Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Masaccio. He studies all of those other artists to learn their styles and techniques. He comes home and sets up a workshop. Now, Dürer, as you can see in this painting, is more than capable of doing fine art. This is oil on a wooden panel. He is more than capable of creating beautiful artwork. One-of-a-kind, original paintings, frescoes, he's trained in that stuff. But that is not where the money is for Dürer in the HRE. There are a lot of people in the HRE who are much more interested in buying artworks for their private collection in their home. Many of the people who are in Dürer's geographical location are not fans of artworks in churches. They do not want publicly displayed artwork. They want private artwork for their home, which means they want something more reasonably priced. They want a copy of reproducible artwork, a limited edition, one of 500, one of 1,000, something that is more affordable for their personal private home collection. Dürer, therefore, specializes in woodcuts, etchings, and engravings. But believe me, I'm not casting shade on the man. He and his workshop create things that are gorgeous. For example, this is actually one of Dürer's pieces, and this is a woodcut. That means that the picture you're seeing on your screen, that's a wooden stamp. Now, to me, oh my gosh. I mean, most of you guys have played with rubber stamps at some point in your life. If you can imagine, same thing, like a rubber stamp, except no rubber, instead the entire top is carved wood. If you can imagine the detail that is required to be carved into a block of wood to do that thing. This is just like unbelievable. Now, this is fairly small. Again, personal, private, going into someone's home. This image of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is about 9.5 by 11 or 12 inches. Basically, think of it like an oversized book. It is what is called a folio at this point in the 1500s. Basically, what this is intended to be is part of a folio book. What this is a collection of stamped images, woodcut images. And on the front of each page is this nice picture. And then on the back of each page is text, an excerpt from the Bible, whatever Bible verse or Bible passage the picture is illustrating, with commentary or extra information. So front of the page, picture, back of the page, text and commentary. Basically what this folio book is, putting it into our modern terminology, this is a coffee table book, only they don't really have coffee tables yet. Yes, coffee is a thing. Actually, coffee is a major problem at this point in history. There are actually laws against it and a large debate over whether coffee is evil and going to destroy society. That's a whole other issue. I can link you out in extras to that whole thing. It has nothing to do with this. But basically, what Albrecht Dürer here is creating is what we would call a coffee table book, an oversized book that you could display in your home, look at, review with beautiful pictures. That is why Albrecht Dürer's images are so detailed. This is not a picture you're going to see one time in church, guys. This is a picture you're going to have in your home. You're going to flip through this book over and over again. You're going to look at it. You're going to study it. You're going to stare at it. It's going to be a form of entertainment, something that you actually learn from, maybe even something you use to help your children learn how to read. That means that Dürer wants his images to be incredibly detailed, because this is not a quick one and done. Dürer includes all sorts of details, hidden images, things that you might not notice at first glance, but you'll notice when you go back and look at it thoroughly. And Dürer targets those details to his protesting audience, to people who want reform in the church, to people who agree with Martin Luther's sentiments about corruption and not trusting the Pope not being God's voice on earth. For example, in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, there's a lot of details, but if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice there is this figure that is being trampled by the horse of the apocalyptic death. This is death in the Four Horsemen down here. The figure that's actually being trampled down below under the hooves of death's horse is interesting, because if you look at it very closely, look at the hat this person is wearing. Guys, that's the papal tiara. That's the Pope's crown. This down here, that's actually the Pope or a high-ranking church official being trampled by death and then eaten by this weird cat demon down here at the bottom. Basically, in the image, what Dürer is implying is the Pope is nobody magic or special. He dies too. Basically, you're not going to have the Pope being trampled by death and eaten by a demon if you're trying to sell this to a Roman Catholic audience. This is being targeted at protesters, at reformers, at people who are challenging the authority of the Pope. And Dürer is targeting that audience, and that audience exists all the way back in 1497 and 1498, long before Martin Luther makes this formal with the 95 Thesis. Dürer's artwork, these reproducible artwork, are targeting people who already are sympathetic to these ideas, who are sympathetic to this cause, who want this artwork in their home, who want to study, who want to read the Bible and seek answers for themselves, people who are interested in Christian humanism and the Via Moderna. All of Dürer's artworks are these gorgeous, detailed images printed on a printing press in reproducible formats. This one is a woodcut. Again, here's your AD down at the bottom, guys. It's a Dürer artwork. This one is an engraving instead. This is Dürer's engraving of Adam and Eve. Now, again, an engraving is a copper panel, a piece of copper, that is actually scraped. The surface is engraved or scraped directly to create gradients from white to black, rolled with ink, and then wiped away. The rougher portions have more ink. They're darker, smoother portions, lighter, going to come out lighter white. You can see in Dürer's Adam and Eve that idea of androgyny, the idea of the male body as the perfect body and the female body being a knockoff version, the more effeminate male, the more masculine female is still very muchly in force here. Again, because Dürer is targeting that protester-leaning audience, there is so much detail. I am not going to delve into all the detail and symbolism in many of Dürer's artworks because that's a possible section project. If you guys want to know what all the images in a Dürer painting means, go check out the section project so you can find all of them for a section project. Here, everything in the picture has meaning and symbolism. That is Dürer's hallmark. There is, I mean, everything from the sheep or goat in the background, the parrot, the cat, the rabbit, the ox, the elk, the mouse, the sign. All of these images are not just there because they look good. Every detail that Dürer includes in his image means something. It is symbolic. Dürer is basically catering to an audience that wants to seek answers for themselves, that wants all these details, that wants to learn, that wants to come back to the image over and over again. Dürer's images are specifically targeted to sell to those audiences. They are reproducible artworks. They are affordable to have in your home because they're in a print run. And they are filled with things that reward the viewer for learning, for looking at detail, for finding answers for themselves, for being educated. This again is a Dürer engraving called Melancholia I. And again, it is filled with so many images, details, things that reward the educated person, even down to this. This is what they call a magical square. Basically, it's a math trick where the numbers in the rectangle or in the square add up or combine to a similar total, no matter which direction you do them. All of these things are intended to reward the person who is going to look at this, who is going to learn. Dürer is targeting his audience. He wants to sell stuff, so he's targeting people who believe in seeking answers for yourself, educating and improving yourself. All of Dürer's pieces, including this image of Night, Death, and the Devil, have the same level of beautiful detail. They cater to an audience that is interested in exploring and learning, and they reflect Dürer's own passion in exploring and learning. Dürer, as I mentioned earlier, is an extremely accomplished artist in a variety of different mediums, a variety of different forms, from oil painting to fresco to etching, engraving, woodcuts. Dürer himself is constantly sketching and drawing, and as someone who believes in Christian humanism, as someone who believes in seeking answers for yourself and exploring the world, Dürer's artwork is fascinating because he is constantly exploring the world, and he finds everything interesting. Dürer's personal sketches and experimentations, they're gorgeous. I mean, on the upper left, this image of a rabbit is very unusual. We haven't seen a lot of pictures of animals or of landscapes up to this point. People have been the exclusive focus because of the ideas of chain of being. Human beings are worth your time. Everything else is lower than them on the chain. So everything else just exists to help human beings survive and thrive. You wouldn't want to make artwork of it because it's not really that important. It's just there to help human beings survive. The chain of being, however, is beginning to break down. Artists who lean toward this explore and experiment point of view are going to be more interested in everything in their world. I mean, I loved your sketch of the dog here because it has personality. The dog is listening, it's paying attention. The dog is worthy of being portrayed, being drawn as a being with personality in its own right. Again, the detail is mind-boggling. Dürer's rabbit up here at the top, you can see the AD. This bunny, which is beautiful, I mean, the texture on its fur, it looks soft. Part of what makes it so amazing, if any of you listening, if you yourself are familiar with art, if you are an artist, that picture of a rabbit, that's a watercolor. Getting that kind of detail on a watercolor, that kind of precision, shows you exactly what an artistic, amazing person Dürer is. I mean, Dürer, the picture of the rhinoceros down here at the bottom, That picture of a rhinoceros is really amazing because Dürer has never seen a rhinoceros. This is Dürer's version of a rhinoceros based on an oral description. Basically, someone who saw a rhinoceros described it to Dürer, and this is what Dürer is actually able to create. Why? Because he wants to get a glimpse. He wants an idea of what it looked like. He's curious about the whole world. He is constantly seeking answers. Then many of these artworks are not big sellers. I mean, these are personal sketches and designs. Dürer is targeting that audience. Dürer is talking about personal learning. With this shift, with these protesters, this idea of learning for yourself is beginning to seep out. It's not just about religion, guys. It's everywhere. It's in art and culture. It's in studying animals, plants, the landscape, not just focusing on human beings. This idea that God gave you potential and you should use it basically begins to encompass what we would call science. Curiosity in the natural world. That learning, like your relationship with God, is incredibly personal. Learn what you can. Explore your world. And those ideas are not limited to the protesters. Certainly the protesters are going to highlight them, but they become part of the world as a whole, for Protestants and for Catholics. This idea of personal relationship with God, this idea of a personal connection. It's not just about the community, it is also about you making a connection with that community. Those ideas are going to bleed over and they're going to show up not only in artwork like Albrecht Dürer's, not only on artwork made on a printing press reproducible, but they're also going to show up in artwork intended for a Catholic audience, an artwork intended for a more public display, which is going to be more typical, more comfortable for a Catholic audience. One of the examples of that is a guy that we know as Matthias Grunewald. Now, Matthias Grunewald is difficult because we don't know as much about Grunewald as we would like to. In fact, there is some question about Grunewald because of a confusion in sources from the time period that basically suggest that Grunewald may be mixed up with or conflated with another artist named Master Mathis or Mathis the Painter. Technically, we don't know if they're two different people or if they're the same person. Regardless, what we do know is that Matthias Grunewald was a painter who traveled around the areas of the HRE looking for work, predominantly one-of-a-kind original public work, which puts him working largely in Catholic commissions. Now, Grunewald actually ends up doing his most famous work in one of the worst locations. He ends up getting a job in the small town of Eisenheim. Eisenheim is not a place at this point in history where you want to be. Eisenheim is a small town in a marshy region, and Eisenheim is struggling because a lot of the grains, the common grains, will not grow in their soil and environmental conditions. So the town of Eisenheim is really only able to grow rye. And I mean, on one hand, you're like, dude, rye, that's cool. I mean, they can make Reubens. What's wrong with that? The problem is that rye grain is a type of grain. It is a plant that is highly vulnerable to a particular type of fungus. That fungus is ergot. Ergot grows as a black extension over pieces of the rye grain. You can actually see it in the picture here. It is colloquially sometimes called witch's fingers because it looks like these black cartoon Halloween fingers. Basically, this ergot, this fungus that grows on the rye, is really, really nasty stuff. It is specifically designed to take advantage of the rye to propagate itself. The problem is that because, well, other things eat rye grain, the ergotism will be consumed. Guys, don't eat ergot. It's a really bad thing. Ergot is not targeted at people, but if people consume ergot, really bad things happen. There are two types of ergot, both of them horrifying. When consumed, they create a condition or conditions known as ergotism. Ergot in general is what we call a vasoconstrictor, which means when you eat ergot, it tells your body to shut down or constrict your blood vessels. Smallest ones, of course, are most first affected. When someone gets ergotism from the first form of ergot, basically it shuts down the circulation to their extremities. You get bleeding under the skin from the capillaries rupturing. You also get blackness and a burning sensation in the hands and feet. It's similar to what happens, technically what happens in frostbite, because basically the circulation is cut off to the hands and feet, fingers and toes. There's a extreme burning sensation, which in the 1500s is sometimes called St. Anthony's fire because of the legend of a saint. And basically there's this incredible burning sensation. It's incredibly painful, and then that pain stops, mostly because the circulation has been stopped to the extremity for long enough that the tissue has died. It turns black, like frostbite or gangrene, and someone suffering from extreme ergotism, you can like snap off their fingers and toes because it's completely dead and there's no bleeding because, well, the flesh has died because there's no blood flow to it. The other type of ergot is equally horrifying. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. It causes hallucinations and convulsions. Now, of course, that type of ergot has actually been used throughout history because human beings will eat anything if it makes them trip balls. So that type of ergot has been used as a hallucinogen. It's just, again, when you don't have modern pharmacology to tell us what quantities are safe, people kill themselves. Now, in the town of Eisenheim, no one is taking this for, a good trip, okay? Basically, these people are starving. They have no food. The only food available to them is made with rye grain, which is infected by ergot. So you have people whose fingers and toes are turning black. You have people who are convulsing. You have people with black hemorrhaging under the skin. You have people who are hallucinating. And these people come to the only hospital for treatment. Now, guys, if you remember a few lectures ago, I told you that part of the reason the church is so important at this point in history is not just for religious purposes. The church is the social safety net. So these people who are suffering from ergotism, these people who are convulsing and having problems with circulation, they are brought to the local church because the church is the hospital. This is the only place you can get treatment, and you don't have to pay for it because it's charity, it's good deeds. So these people are brought to the local monastery, which basically becomes the local emergency ward. Not only that, as the summer goes on and the heat goes up, they have an outbreak of bubonic plague as well. So you've got ergotism and bubonic plague. The monastery, the main chapel of the monastery, has basically been converted into a triage unit. It's a place for people who are convulsing. Many of them are dying. People who are suffering from the plague. They are getting basic medical attention in this big room. And it's horrible and it's depressing. Most of them are going to die. They're suffering. They're in pain. They feel alone. Therefore, when the artist Matthias Grunwald comes to the town of Eisenheim, that monastery hires him to paint an altarpiece, a big public artwork to go at the front of this church. Basically, it's a picture at the front of a hospital ward. So the people who are suffering, the people who feel alone, the people who feel hopeless can look up and see a picture that will remind them that they're not alone, that there is someone who understands, and there is a hope, if not in this life, in the next life. The image that Matthias Grunwald creates for a public location, Catholic, becomes known as the Eisenheim altarpiece. It is a interesting piece made up of multiple images. If you look carefully here in the picture on your screen, you will see there's a vertical line right here. That is not an error in the photograph on the PowerPoint. That's a real vertical line on the painting, because this painting is actually a cabinet. There are 3 different sets of images. These pieces are actually doors. Each one of these is a hinged door that can be opened outward to reveal another set of images inside. I will show you all 3 sets of images on the Eisenheim altarpiece. The exterior set is the one that was most commonly on display. Basically, those doors would be open to show the other sets of images at different times of the year, like for different holidays. Now, the outside of the Eisenheim altarpiece has 3 parts. The part at the bottom is a Pietà. You've got Mary holding the body of Jesus down here at the bottom on the stand or the support, all right? On both side panels, you have images of 2 saints associated with ergotism, the guy on this side. The saint was supposed to speak to God on behalf of those suffering from ergotism. And then on this side, you've got the saint who was supposed to help speak to God on behalf of those suffering from the plague. So you've got the 2 different saints who are supposed to help with disease. Remember, people are sick and dying looking up at this thing. So those are visual reminders of who to ask to speak to God on your behalf. And then the central panel, the immediately visible one here, is actually one of the most grotesque crucifixion scenes you will ever see. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. All right. Now, this is a artwork created by a Catholic artist for Catholic viewing. It is very large. Let me show you. You can see, yes, the screen says it's 9 by 10, but hang on. Here it is on display, which actually gives you a better sense of the size of the painting. You can see the tourists, the people, compared to the size of the painting, which kind of gives you a better sense of scale. This is not Protestant audience, guys. A Protestant audience would want something small, personal, that would fit inside their own house. This is intended at a Catholic audience who is going to be viewing it in a public location. In this place, a hospital ward. Now, like I said, there are multiple layers to the Eisenheim altarpiece. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them because, again, this is a potential section project for you guys, looking into more detail, learning more about the Eisenheim altarpiece. The outer panels, the ones that are most commonly on display, are these panels. These are the ones that you saw before. You've got the 2 saints, one on either side here, again, to remind the people in the hospital who they should talk to, who will speak to God and intercede on their behalf. And then the central panel shows this detailed crucifixion scene. In the crucifixion scene, you have Jesus on the cross. We'll talk more about him in a moment. And then on the sides, you have John the Baptist pointing to Jesus as the Messiah. There is blood flowing from the wound in Jesus' side to a cup down here, held in the crook of a lamb's leg. This idea of Jesus as the Lamb of God, the sacrifice, taking the punishment that people deserve. Here's Mary Magdalene kneeling at the foot of the cross. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And this is actually John the Beloved Apostle. Again, this is a reference to the story of Jesus' crucifixion in the Bible and those events. Now, when you open this up, when you open the cabinet doors, this is the next layer inside. Inside this one, on the back of the image I just showed you, you have the Annunciation, the angel telling Mary that she's going to give birth to Jesus, the Messiah. You have the birth of Jesus up here. You have Mary holding and caring for baby Jesus. And then over here on this side, you have Jesus coming back from the dead, the resurrection. These panels are panels of hope and joy. It is the promise of salvation. And the resurrection image is particularly notable in the way that Matthias Grunwald portrays it as different from other contemporary resurrection images. Again, I'll show you that in more detail in just a moment. Inside this, again, these are cabinet doors. These open as well. These are hinged. The third layer of images from the Eisenheim altarpiece is actually 2 paintings and then a series of carvings. Now, Grunwald has nothing to do with these carvings. These are already extant in the church when he's hired to do the painted altarpiece. These carvings and images honor Saint Anthony, who is actually the saint that this monastery is dedicated to. So basically, this is a monastery dedicated to this guy who supposedly overcame plague and fought demons, which is highly appropriate for a place that is being used as a hospital for victims of ergotism and plague. Now, those outer images of the crucifixion scene, I said that this crucifixion scene is really kind of disgusting, and it is. If you look at the body of Jesus in this crucifixion scene, when Grunwald paints Jesus, he does something really interesting. The body of Jesus is modeled with swollen lymph glands and black splotches, as if there's hemorrhaging under the skin. Why? Well, those are the symptoms of ergotism and the bubonic plague. Grunwald gives Jesus the same physical symptoms that the people suffering, dying, struggling, looking up at this painting in the hospital ward would have on their own bodies. He's making that connection. I started this talking about this personal connection, this idea that it's not just a public ritual, it involves feeling, personal connection. Grunwald is creating that personal connection by showing that Jesus does understand what they're suffering. Jesus understands what they're going through. He depicts Jesus as having the same affliction as the people suffering in the hospital beds to create that understanding, that personal connection. In the same way, if you look at Jesus' hands and feet in the painting, they're very distorted, stiffened, almost as if Jesus is convulsing. Remember, one of the signs and symptoms of ergotism is convulsions. Again, Grunwald is trying to make that personal connection with his audience, to show them that Jesus empathizes. Jesus is not just some unreachable fat puffy baby in a meadow somewhere. There is a sense of understanding, a personal connection, of empathy that is very much a part of this reform movement. Even when you're looking at a Catholic artwork, there is still that desire to make it more emotional, more personal, less chain of being, more visceral. You also see that on the inside of the Eisenheim altarpiece with that resurrection picture I mentioned earlier. In this image, Jesus' resurrection is depicted very differently from other contemporary depictions. Most pictures of Jesus coming back from the dead show Jesus coming out of a stone tomb, wearing a toga, looking a little bit tired. Oh, coming back from the dead takes so much work. Grunwald's instead is the exploding Jesus. You'll notice that Jesus is kind of like erupting or exploding from a stone sarcophagus down here. He's blown the top off. There were 2 guards. One guard is like ass over tea kettle here in the background. He's like in the middle of a roll. The guy in the front has just been knocked to the ground, and he's like got his arm back, like shielding his face, trying to like prevent himself from being blinded. Jesus is suspended in midair, glowing. In fact, it's kind of hard to see where his head ends and the glow starts. Not only that, there is so much power in this resurrection. He's got like rays of light coming off of the holes in his hands and feet from the crucifixion. He is like, he's like wielding lightsabers from his hands and feet because there's so much power coming off of him. Why do that? Because Grunwald is telling these people who are suffering and dying, Jesus has the power to save them. Even if that's not healing their disease, even if that means they die and go into the afterlife, someone who understands their suffering has the power to give them something better. There's a deeply personal connection, a personal outreach, a degree of empathy, sympathy here that really gets this idea of a personal connection, not just a checklist, not just a ritual across. We are leaving the scholastics behind for a far more Christian humanist point of view, whether that's Catholic or Protestant. This is really neat. It leads us toward individualism, but it also has a very unexpected consequence that's totally logical, but it's not something I would have ever thought of. Basically, if this idea comes through about personal connection, God cares about your personal situation, God wants you to believe in God, it's this personal recruitment. This idea that if God's recruiting, the devil probably is through too, comes through. And there is this huge upswing in fears of witchcraft and witch hunts in the 1520s and 1530s. There is this blossoming of instruction manuals on how to tell if someone's a witch, books on demonology. If any of you guys are familiar with Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, that's from this time period. There's this idea that, yes, you can have a personal connection with God, but thereby, logically, you can also have a personal connection with the devil. And there is this fear, this looking for signs of personal connection. Just as good deeds are considered signs of a personal connection with God, personal faith and emotion leads to these behaviors. Well, personal faith and practice of worship of the devil also leads to certain actions and behaviors. And anything people don't understand is assigned as magic and witchcraft. Now, weirdly enough, that fear of the unknown and the unfamiliar also is going to spill over into a horrible fear of science. Science is also on the upswing here with this idea of seeking answers for yourself. Don't trust authorities. Don't just trust what someone else says. Try it and find out. That focus on experimentation, on trying to learn about natural law, about natural science, about the way that the world works through a scientific lens, creates a great deal of fear and accusations of witchcraft. Now, that may sound a little wacky and ridiculous to you at first because, well, science and witchcraft are like not the same thing. Well, yeah, if you know what they are. But guys, if you don't understand how science works, you know what science looks like? It looks like magic. Basically, if you don't understand the scientific process, the technique behind something, science looks like magic. Trust me, you can do science experiments and totally convince a 3-year-old you're a wizard. It's pretty cool. Basically, that's what's going on. And they don't have, how do I say this the right way? They don't have the same mental boxes that we do. You and I file things based on education and training. We file things as this is science. We file things as this is woo-woo magic. This is stage magic. This is, weird tinfoil hat on the internet. We have labels, categories. We delineate between science and not science in very definite ways. We're talking about the 1500s, guys. They haven't made those boxes yet. There's this huge overlap. They are learning what science is. They don't even know what it is yet. They're basically trying to figure out what is science, what is not, and they don't know. They're doing it through experiment. Things that sound logical, we're like, of course that's not science. Guys, if you don't know, it kind of makes sense. Like, for example, one of the big things that's popular in the 1500s and considered a legitimate science is alchemy. There are people out there trying to turn lead into gold. And we're like, well, it doesn't work that way. I mean, you can turn lead into gold, but it is impractical because the science and chemistry required. Guys, they don't know. They look similar. They have similar properties. They're both highly malleable. It seems logical that you could turn one into the other. They don't know. I mean, they have not reached advanced science yet. They're just figuring stuff out. It is logical in a weird way that people see a lot of early science as witchcraft because some of it kind of is. It's this weird pseudo-science mystical, we're still figuring stuff out. For example, let me introduce you to a brilliant scientist of this era who fits very muchly into this gray, is it science or not? His name is Paracelsus. He's a brilliant guy. He's still very important today in modern science. He is one of the founders of toxicology. He basically does what today we would call pharmaceutical science. For example, throughout history, all the way back from ancient Greece, people knew that chewing willow bark actually helped with headaches. Now, don't look at the screen funny. Yes, it does. Chewing willow bark will help a headache. Seriously, it actually will. Paracelsus is the first guy to go, okay, so chewing willow bark helps a headache? Why? There's got to be a reason. He isn't willing to just accept you chew the bark of the tree and it helps. Paracelsus says there must be something in the bark. And sure enough, Paracelsus is actually the first person to isolate the chemical compounds that we would actually consider to be modern aspirin. I mean, that sounds weird, but he's actually the person to figure out the chemistry, the actual chemical materials that we use in modern aspirin. And sure enough, they're in willow bark. If you break down willow bark, you will find the compounds that make aspirin. That's what actually helps the headache, not the bark. Paracelsus is the person to figure that out. Now, that's chemistry, guys. That's science. Paracelsus actually happens to be the last documented individual who claims to have the Philosopher's Stone. Now, we're like, that's alchemy. That's magic. That's not science. Guys, it's the same dude. Paracelsus is doing legitimate chemical treatments in toxicology, and he's trying to find the Philosopher's Stone and become immortal. To him, this is not a contradiction. Both of these things are science in this era. There isn't that clear line and delineation. So there is a lot of confusion, a lot of fear, a lot of crossover between what people see as witchcraft, what people see as science, a lot of questions about how this fits into physical experience, and it taps into that deep fear of passion and lust that we've seen earlier on, this fear of original sin, and loss of self-control, and lack of understanding how witchcraft, science, the world actually works. We see this overlap and confusion throughout artwork, but one of the most spectacular examples of it is in the paintings of an artist by the name of Hieronymus Bosch. Now, Hieronymus Bosch is a fascinating artist, and the more you research Hieronymus Bosch, the more fascinating he gets. Hieronymus Bosch is an unusual artist who practices something called narrative art. Basically, narrative art, and I'm going to have this term on another slide in a few minutes, narrative art is artwork that is filled with a zillion different people. It looks crowded. It looks like an image of a crowd, like at a concert or event, all right? And as you look at this giant crowded painting, the closer you look, you see all sorts of little vignettes, little things happening inside the larger picture. When you zoom in, there are 100 different stories happening within a single larger story. Hieronymus Bosch specializes in these kinds of paintings, but Hieronymus Bosch also specializes in paintings that, for lack of a better term, look like an acid trip. Hieronymus Bosch is considered one of the first surrealist artists. He is not part of the surrealist movement, but his stuff, woo, it's weird. Hieronymus Bosch is also fascinating to us because we know nothing about this dude. We know, like, literally almost nothing. We believe he lived in a small town in the HRE, and we don't think he left. Yeah. That's it, guys. I mean, we really don't know anything. We don't have any record of him going to study like Dürer did. Dürer went to Italy to study. We have no record of that with Bosch. We know, like, nothing. In fact, we do not even know who purchased most of Bosch's works. We have no idea what their provenance is. When we find out, most mentions of them are someone writing home and saying, dude, I saw this thing that looked like an acid trip. Whoa. We have no idea where they were originally supposed to be displayed, who originally purchased them, and that makes them even more fascinating. What we do know from looking at the paintings is that Bosch seems to paint as fast as he can, potentially to keep up with his imagination, which means Bosch's imagination is a really scary place and I wouldn't want to go there. One of Bosch's best known artworks that illustrates all of that beautifully is a painting that becomes known as the Garden of Earthly Delights. The first time that we hear any record of this painting is when someone sees it in a courthouse on the second story in a hallway. And basically he writes home saying, I saw this painting in the hallway of a courthouse and wow. We do not think that that's the original location of the painting. We do have no idea who purchased the painting. That's just the first time we hear about it, and we're in agreement with that guy who wrote home and went, wow. Now, this painting, like the Eisenheim altarpiece, is in a cabinet format. The outside of the Garden of Earthly Delights, when closed, looks like this. Two doors or panels with hinges on the side close over, and then there's a space in the middle where those doors are going to open. The image on the outside of the cabinet is actually painted in blue and gray scale. It depicts the earth in a format typical of this time period. It is commonly believed at this point in history that the earth is a sphere, but not the way we think of it, like a globe. At this point, it is commonly believed that the earth itself, the land of the earth, is indeed flat. So the land and the sea, your ocean and land mass, is a flat disk. It is balanced because the bottom of this flat surface is rounded. So underground below us is this rounded or cut off bottom of a half sphere. So flat on top, round on the bottom. Think like half a basketball or half a styrofoam ball. Above us, the top of the sphere is the heavens, or the atmosphere above us. And basically, it's like a giant atmospheric dome, in their opinion. So you got this atmospheric dome, air, atmosphere above us, and then you've got earth, ground, rock below us, and then the earth and the sea are this flat piece in the middle. That's fairly typical of the way that they view the earth and the sky. The earth is flat, but there's a rounded ground below it and a dome of atmosphere above it. So the whole thing is a sphere, but the land is a flat middle ground. We'll come back to that later in the next lecture. Outside of that, floating in his own separate bubble, is this image of God right up here. And beside this at the top is a quote from the book of Psalms. This quote from the book of Psalms is considered to be the justification, the proof, quote unquote, if you will, for the idea that the earth is flat and in this bubble, all right? The passage from Psalms says, for he spoke and it came to be, he commanded and it stood firm. It is the teaching of most religious and therefore scientific belief at the time. Told you, Christianity is more a cultural standard. It's woven into everything here. The phrase, it stood firm in this book of Psalms means that the earth is set. It's not moving. We're like floating at the center of the solar system on our little flat disk, and everything else revolves around us. This is called the geocentric idea, and basically geo means earth, so this is earth-centric, earth-centered. We are firm, we stood firm, we're set, we're fixed, we're not moving, and everything else moves around us. We are on this flat thing with dome bubble. Okay. By the way, this is the most ridiculous thing ever because the book of Psalms in the Bible, the book of the Bible this comes from, is a book of poetry. And just taking poetry literally at any point in history is really stupid, but that's exactly what they're doing. So Bosch here is showing us this earth bubble, and he's got God outside it as the creator and this idea that God commanded and it stood firm. So this is your overall image of the earth as created. Then you open up the cabinet doors on this thing, and this is where the trippy starts. The Garden of Earthly Delights is 3 panels. It's sometimes called a triptych. The central panel is about 6.5 by 7 feet, and the side panels are, again, slightly over 7 feet high and about 3.25 wide. This thing shows 3 different scenes, and within those scenes are a bunch of other little scenes. This is, as I said before, called narrative art. So you've got a very busy, active painting, and then you've got a bunch of small scenes within it. I always compare this if you've ever seen a Where's Waldo book. This is like Where's Waldo on acid. As you're looking for Waldo in the picture, you see all these other crazy little goofy things that are going on in the picture. That's basically what you're going to see here. All right, there are 3 parts to the Garden of Earthly Delights. Part 1 of the Garden of Earthly Delights is actually Bosch's view of the Garden of Eden, particularly the creation of Eve. This is part 1 over here. All right. So this shows the Garden of Eden, supposedly a perfect place. It shows the creation of Eve. We know that in many beliefs during this time period, the creation of Eve is considered the beginning of imperfection. Like we talked about, like you guys read in your quiz, this idea that man was this perfect archetype body. When woman is created, then man loses something. Woman is an imperfect version of man. Man loses that je ne sais quoi femininity. So you can view that first panel as the beginning of things going wrong. Panel 2 shows this idea of lust or sex gone wild. There are two interpretations of this most commonly. One is that this shows depravity, this shows lust gone wild, it shows the dangers of lust and sex. The other is that it shows what would have happened if man had not fallen, this innocent, playful idea of sexuality. In other words, this is all the fun stuff, okay? Your third panel over here shows Bosch's image of hell, which for many interpreters says that this is basically origin of sex, round 1, sex gone wild, round 2, punishment for sex, round 3. Other people view it very differently. Other people view this as beginning of lust and sex in purity and innocence, expression of this if we hadn't screwed it up. And then this is what happened because we screwed it up. Which interpretation is correct? Is it the punishment and horror of lust and sex, or is it this innocent naivete, what could have been? We will never know because we know nothing about Bosch. We have no records of this. It is just like up to you. By the way, as we go through this, yes, in case you start wondering, people have suggested that Bosch was taking ergot for the tripping balls. We don't know that. We don't know anything, but it is an explanation for some of the really bizarre elements. Let me zoom in a little bit and give you a few close-ups and a few details. All right. In the first panel, we see the Garden of Eden. It is this idyllic paradise, which reminds us that Hieronymus Bosch did not get out much. That giraffe is a heck of a thing, and the elephant is interesting too. Yes, those are unicorns in the background. There's all kinds of craziness here. Now, in this idyllic paradise, this Garden of Eden, the image is centered on the creation of Eve at the bottom. You can see here that God in the center is lifting the newly created Eve to her feet. Adam is looking at her. And this is, as far as we can tell, and again, Bosch doesn't tell us this is our conjecture based on the rest of the painting. We believe that this is being portrayed as the beginning of lust, the beginning of sexual desire for good or evil. Now, Bosch appears to give us a number of hints, a number of references that imply that this garden is not actually this perfect place with no death. He's got a bunch of really bizarre creatures in here. My personal favorite is visible here. This is actually a unicorn seahorse, which is most amazing, and I kind of want one. There are also other interesting things, like I swear this is a niffler. There's all kinds of strange little creatures. If any of you guys are familiar with Studio Ghibli in anime, it is worth noting that the founder of Studio Ghibli, Mr. Miyazaki, is obsessed with Hieronymus Bosch. He actually travels the world, and if you look carefully in the background of Garden of Earthly Delights, this right here is actually where Tortoro comes from. If any of you understand what I'm saying and I'm not speaking a weird language, this is the original Tortoro. That's it. That's where it comes from. It's actually a Bosch creature. Okay, I'm going to come back to speaking English now. This image also shows hints, however, that perhaps paradise has already been ruined. For example, there is a cat with a rat in its mouth over here. One of my students tried convincing me that just Mr. Cat is helping his friend, Mr. Mouse, across the garden. It kind of seems like an implication that death is involved. In the same way, there's a bird with a frog in its mouth. There's a really weird, deformed, two-headed lizard. There is a hint here and there that creation may already have gotten off track. There's also other hints of death. In the background, there is a cave with like this entire flock of what appear to be crows. Crows and ravens are carrion eaters, guys. They eat dead things, which is an odd choice for a garden where supposedly there is no death. There's also something else interesting in the middle of the painting. There's this purple thing. We don't know what it is. Some scholars have suggested it might actually reference an alchemical piece of equipment. We know that alchemists, these pseudosciences, often used very elaborate blown glass beakers and chemistry equipment. In the middle of it is an owl, a traditional symbol of witchcraft. So again, you're getting back to that association of witchcraft with lust, desire, the unknown. And beneath that, this little island, you can see in the close-up, this whole island is made up of chemistry equipment and glass beakers. Again, possibly a reference to that fear of science and that conflation of science with witchcraft, with magic, with this fear of lust and lack of control. Then, of course, we go from the Garden of Eden image to the middle image. I would like to repeat the fact that we know almost nothing about Hieronymus Bosch. Whatever you think you see, yes. Yes, they are doing that. Why? I do not know why. Don't ask me. I do not have an answer. Nobody does. In the background, I know you're not looking at the background. In the background, you've got these same shapes, which may again be chemistry equipment, alchemical equipment. They may be a reference to that fear of alchemy, science as the unknown. Now, overall, and I'm going to show you some close-ups, overall, we really do not know where Bosch is getting his ideas from. Again, there's narrative, art, there's all kinds of details and vignettes in this very large, bizarre picture. What we do know, we know that in other paintings of the time period context, we know that fish, birds, and fruit are all symbols of feminine fertility and sexuality, lust, and desire. So you've got those all over the place. There is also something else I'll talk about in a second here. When you zoom in on the vignettes, remember narrative art, big picture, small stories inside, this thing just keeps getting weirder. I do not have, no one has explanations for this. Please remember Bosch is painting as fast as he can in order to keep up with his own imagination. Like I said, this is not an imagination I would like to visit. Whatever you think, I don't know what's going on. No, I don't know why that bird is nothing. Yes, she is sticking flowers in the guy's butt. Again, nothing. I mean, the closer you look at the Garden of Earthly Delights, the weirder things get. They're just, why is those people, I don't know. Why is there a bear? I don't know. Why are their butts bruised? I don't want to know. I mean, this is bizarre imagery, and yet Bosch uses it extensively. Like I said, he fascinates us because other artists are not making pictures that look like this. Bosch is a unique one-off, and we do not have an explanation for him. Now, panel 3, moving over into panel 3, this is Bosch's depiction of hell, potentially, again, we don't know for sure, the punishment for all of this cherry picking and dancing. Bosch's vision of hell is pretty darn horrific and disturbing. It has a variety of horrific imagery and punishments. Many of them seem to relate back to the images of the 7 deadly sins. Now, again, you have these vignettes, these small, bizarre things happening inside this larger picture, narrative art. And many of them are very disturbing. I mean, here in this image, you have references to gambling, to lust. You have all kinds of very dark, bizarre, disturbing, and highly sexual images. And again, Bosch includes all of these very surreal, disturbing vignettes within the larger narrative art. Again, Bosch creates these strange, twisted images of good or heroism, what people would think being heroic, like the knight on your upper left, being sliced, diced, and destroyed in this hopeless, horrifying nightmare world of his hell in the last panel. Bosch also, we think, again, he doesn't tell us, we think references common beliefs at the time. In this image, in this particular part, you'll see a bird-headed creature devouring someone with like flames coming out their butt, and birds, don't know. And then these people that are being devoured are excreted into a pit where other people are vomiting and defecating. You will also see, however, his references to common ideas at the time, we think. Over here, there's a guy with a flute up his butt. You will actually see throughout Bosch's vision of hell that musical instruments and the idea of listening to music are shown as horrific. Here, musical instruments are being used as torture devices, and higher in the painting, there's actually a pair of ears with a knife going between them. At the time, we know that it is common belief that music actually lowers your resistance to sexual desire, and music makes you less likely to be able to keep control of yourself. So if you listen to music, you're going to lose control of yourself and go wild. That lack of control, that loss of control is, of course, considered sinful and horrific in this time period. So the musical instruments are here being used as symbols of torture and hell as punishment for these people giving into weakness. There is also music in the Bosch's version of hell, both written music over here on the book, and here we have butt music. Yes, that is a musical score written on a dude's butt. Yes, a music major in college actually has transcribed and play this. I will link you out in the extras down below, just in case you have to hear the butt music. Now, guys, this is not a one-off. That's part of what makes Bosch so fascinating to us. This thing is really weird, and we don't have an explanation. But Bosch's artwork as a whole, this is not like one painting that Bosch does. When you look up, these are both Hieronymus Bosch paintings as well. When you look up Bosch, this is what you get, guys. And we do not have definitive explanations for any of them. Yes, people have tried to interpret Bosch's work, they've tried to understand, but overall, we don't know. Bosch is just bizarre and fascinating, and he inspires many artists later on, including a guy by the name of Salvador Dali. But Bosch is the OG, guys. Bosch is one of the first artists to create these bizarre images, and he still fascinates us to this day because we do not have an explanation as to why or what. Now, other artists do also use narrative artwork, more like Bosch. For example, this is a painting by another artist named Peter Bruegel the Elder called The Triumph of Death. And again, it is narrative art. It is an image of, well, I always joke, it's the zombie apocalypse. Basically, it's an army of the dead coming and defeating the living. And the dead are going to triumph because, well, everybody who dies joins the army. There are small scenes, different things happening within the larger picture, again, making it narrative art. And it is, again, very dark and surreal. However, once again, I keep repeating myself, this is not common in style. Yes, it happens, but overall, most artwork is not going to look like this. Most artwork is going to look a lot more like Peter Bruegel the Younger, The Peasant Wedding Feast. This is basically a bunch of peasants at a wedding reception, having a really simple party. This is what most of your artwork is going to look like. It's going to be focused on ordinary people doing things that they enjoy, simple, wholesome, hard-working things, and finding fun and joy in doing their best and living up to their potential. It is going to come back predominantly in artwork to personal, wholesome things that people would buy to put in their home rather than pictures of kings, princes, and popes intended for public display.